Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to get started here in just a couple minutes with Rose Scott and Zoë Burkholder. Just give people a few more minutes to come in the room this evening. Going to go ahead and introduce tonight's guest, and then I think by the time that I'm done, we'll have our full crowd here this evening. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. My name is Claire Haley, and I'm the Vice President of Public Relations and Programs for the History Center. And I am just so thrilled to be welcoming you all this evening. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. We're just so grateful that you're spending your Wednesday night with us tonight on Zoom. We have two guests with us this evening, both very special, and we're so excited to have them. Tonight's featured author is Zoë Burkholder. She's a professor of educational foundations at Montclair State University. And she is the author of Color in the Classroom, How American Schools Taught Race from 1900 to 1954, and the co-author of Integrations, The Struggle for Racial Equality in Civic Renewal and Public Education. And of course, she is the author of her newest book, An African American Dilemma, A History of School Integration and Civil Rights in the North. So if you have not yet bought your copy of the book, you'll be able to do so from Atlanta History Center's museum shop. We offer domestic US delivery as well as pickup in shop. And as a special gift for tonight, we have 25% off those copies of Zoe's book. So if you haven't yet gotten it, now's your chance. I'll post a link to do that in the chat shortly. Zoë will be talking tonight with Rose Scott. If you are around the Atlanta area and pay any attention at all, I think she needs very little introduction, but we're so happy that she's joining us. Rose Scott is an award-winning journalist and host of the midday news program Closer Look, heard on Atlanta's NPR station WABE 90.1. In her role as host, she's interviewed foreign heads of states, cabinet members, U.S. ambassadors, consul generals, state and local elected officials, as well as civic and social leaders. Closer Look has become a signature broadcast for the community and brings together viewpoints from all sectors of society. She has numerous awards and recognitions, too many for me to go through tonight, but needless to say, it's going to be a really great conversation. So Rose and Zoë, thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Claire, and good evening, everyone. I know it seems like I've been saying this a lot lately, but under normal circumstances, we would all be together in a nice auditorium or a hall, but we continue to live in these extraordinary times. And I think, when we put all this in perspective, and I know Zoë knows this as well, you think about so many who've lost their lives due to COVID-19, and then lives affected either through loss or other circumstances directly linked to the virus. And we also know this pandemic has amplified the ongoing systemic inequities and disparities prevalent in so many of our what we call quality of life sectors, right? For example, education, and especially K through 12 public education. But this isn't new. The history of America's public education system is thoroughly chronicled, the good, the bad, the achievements, the still systemic challenges. And Zoë has done much of this chronicling herself. And in her new book, An African American Dilemma, A History of School Integration and Civil Rights in the North, she brings something into light that maybe a lot of people was aware of. And I know that when I had this conversation with several people about the book, they're like, wow, that's something. So let's welcome Zoë into the conversation. Zoë Burkholder, welcome. It's a pleasure.
Hi, thank you, Rose, and thank you, Claire, and thank you to the Atlanta History Center for having me here this evening. I'm really excited to talk about my scholarship, and this is actually one of the first times I've had a chance to present the book anywhere since it was just published in August, but also in a Southern organization hosted in Atlanta. So that's exciting for me to get to have a conversation with folks who live in the South, since so many of the people I speak to in the greater New York City metropolitan area are from or living in the North. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation. Thanks, Rose.
Sure, and we want everyone to know that you just won't be me and Zoë talking, going back and forth. We invite you to be a part of the conversation as well, so you can leave a comment or a question in the chat box. And if you all are going to chat with each other, which we encourage, we just ask that you be respectful and and it's still kind of, in the moment of being respectful for each other. So we want that. But please, by all means, put your question, your comment in the chat box. And Zoe, let's begin here because, as I mentioned, we are in this moment, right? Still with this pandemic. And we talk about public education and where we are right now in this moment. What stood out to you in terms of how we are, what we're learning from COVID-19 and public education right now?
Yeah, it has been a really challenging year and a half for educators and for parents at this point. But for people who work in schools, it's been just unfathomable how challenging this pandemic has been and still is in our communities right now. And one of the things that is becoming more obvious as the months wear on of this pandemic is the way that it is impacting people unequally, unevenly inside of our public schools, inside of our schooling system more broadly. And so we're starting to get more evidence, clearer evidence that we have greater impacts on communities of color, including African-American communities in the United States, and that these burdens of the pandemic are falling especially hard on African-American and other communities of color. And that's not a surprise to scholars. And I think it's one of the things that this history helps us make sense of today, is that when we look at educational inequality in our public schools, what we see is a long-standing pattern of inequality based on race. And that has led us to this moment where currently, when we look at public schools in America, we see very high levels of racial segregation and socioeconomic segregation, what scholars call double segregation. And it's that double segregation that really compounds the problem of educational inequality. So not only do we have schools where students of color, especially Black and Latinx students, are isolated in certain schools, but that those schools also have lower levels of funding, trouble securing high quality teachers, not the kinds of curricula and educational opportunities we might see in majority white schools. So we already have a system where the schools are racially and socioeconomically unequal. And then we had the pandemic on top of that. So it's not surprising really to see the way that this has fallen so heavily on African-American communities. And it should be motivating us and mobilizing us to advocate for change, not just related to the pandemic, but really recognizing that it's time to solve these long-standing disparities and inequalities.
That leads me to our next question, my next question before we get into the book, because everyone says, okay, since we're in this moment, in this space, now is the time to address these long-standing inequities and these long-standing disparities. And then you ask people, okay, so what's next? And then you get a blank stare, or you get a long pause, because there is no one solution that fits.
Yeah, that's true. And it's one of the things that makes this educational history, when we look at school integration, so fascinating and also so complicated, is that each of our hundreds of thousands of schools in this country are unique, they're different, they have different constraints, different challenges, different demographics, different demographic shifts, which can happen very quickly in our public schools. And it means that there is no one solution. We've tried different things. We've tried racial mixing, we've tried equalizing school funding, and people are frustrated that that doesn't instantly solve the problem of educational inequality. And so scholars today try to recognize that there's multiple factors, some of which are not inside of schools at all, but you're talking about factors and things that are context in the broader community related to healthcare, access to jobs, policing in a community. So these are big problems with complicated potential solutions, but that we need to address.
And we'll talk about some of those trends that you say continue as you write your book. And I want to talk about an African-American dilemma, a history of school integration, civil rights in the North, because I want to begin with the perception, Zoe, and that's this. Segregation of our nation's public schools was primarily a Southern ideology that was driven by separatists and segregationists. That's always sort of been the perception here as we've been learning about this. But you could come in and you say, look, hold up, let me tell you about this. That is a perception I think a lot of people had.
It's true. And there's so many reasons for that. And it was something that just became more and more evident as I did this research. Part of it has to do with how scholars have studied the history of education in the North, but especially African American experiences in public schools, where we tend to focus in on one city. Like people will do a study of New York or a study of Detroit or a study of Chicago or a study of Boston. But that doesn't necessarily give you the bigger picture when you kind of step back and look at the broader picture, which is what I do in this book. And another reason that the degree of school segregation is so surprising is because school officials in the North were not keeping records of students or teachers' racial identities, which means it's very challenging as a historian or a scholar, even in a contemporary, now we keep those records, but if you were in the 1940s and you were suddenly curious about the racial demographics of those public schools in your community, the only way you could figure out what they were would be to go into the schools and eyeball it and try to count up students and teachers, which people actually did. They started to do that in the 1940s. But it means that there's a certain kind of invisibility to the problem of school segregation. And that is no accident. That was by design. So we have very high levels of school segregation. It was perfectly legal in the beginning, but became illegal by the end of the 19th century. And because school administrators and white community leaders knew that it was illegal, they made attempts to kind of mask what was going on in their communities, which of course made it harder for any of us in the past or today to see and understand what was going on, especially at this broad level.
So let's go back then. Let's go back after the Civil War. And as Reconstruction begins, tell our audience here, what was the approach to education for many of the Southern states? I think we know, but we're going to let you give that answer.
Right. So when we get to the end of the Civil War, we see two different things. In the North, we have a widespread system of the first free common schools, what we would all call public schools. There's a widespread system of public schools that are established, pretty well established in the North, but not in the South. Southerners were not interested in paying for what they called the education of other people's children. And not only that, but it had been illegal in most Southern states to even teach an enslaved person to read or write. So there was this prohibition against the education of most African Americans before the Civil War. After the Civil War, of course, that changes. And in the South, people begin to build what are called freedmen schools. If we're being more gender inclusive, we'd say freed people schools today. And those were the kind of the beginning of public education for African Americans in the South. But in the North, things were a little bit different. Many public schools before the Civil War excluded African American students in the North. So we have a growing system of common schools and public schools, but they were not treating African American students in the North equally at all. And in fact, in most of our larger cities where you would have small but substantial Black populations, many of those cities built separate schools for Black children. So there were what were called African schools or colored schools in major cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, most of the big cities in the North, you would see separate schools. And that changes over the course of the 19th century too.
Well, then there's a great migration, which we all know that millions of Black Americans from the rural South moved up north, Midwest, West. My family is from Natchez and Shaw, Mississippi, and then we all ended up in St. Louis and Chicago and Cleveland. I don't know how I got to Cleveland, but they got to Cleveland. But so you have this great migration, but there's this, again, perception that Black folks left because there were unsatisfactory economic opportunities and these harsh segregationist laws. And then you go up north, you think, well, education is going to be key, but then you experience some of that same separate segregationist ideology in the North. And in fact, Zoe, you put under the subtitle of The Color Line Moves North, and you write, I'm going to quote you here, although Northern school segregation increased between 1900 and 1940 as Northern populations grew, its most troubling manifestation was along those northern regions that bordered the South. So what are those regions we're talking about here?
So if you look at a map of the United States and you can find where the Mason-Dixon line is, right? Below the Mason-Dixon line, they were running separate school systems for white children and students of color. Above the Mason-Dixon line, in states including New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, those states actually outlawed racial segregation in the public schools in the late 19th century. So during and after the Reconstruction era, except for Indiana, which permitted some school segregation to continue. But the other states all outlawed racial segregation in the public schools. And one of the things that I uncover in my book are actually these patterns that change over time when we find that Northerners tend to support either integration or separation as a strategy to advocate for improved educational opportunities. So for example, from the period in the North from the 1840s to 1900, you see very, very strong support for school integration throughout the North. And a lot of families fight for and advocate for ending those separate schools that had been built during the Civil War and pre-Civil War era and gaining access to the public schools that other kids use. And they're largely successful. And that is a strong and powerful and potent movement. That changes right around the turn of the 20th century. And it's really interesting to kind of watch that change unfold across the region. And two things are happening there. One is the expansion of what we call Jim Crow in the South. So you have this growing system of racial apartheid in the South, and it's hardening. It's being built into law, it's being enforced by the police and the courts, and it's demanding a high level of racial segregation in all aspects of American society. And we all know this story well in the South. What we don't acknowledge or remember or realize is that that invisible line that separated, say, Maryland from New Jersey or Maryland from Pennsylvania didn't necessarily.
Yes, we got you back, Zoe.
Oh my goodness. That was a fun and exciting thing to happen.
It's okay. It's technology, right?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I'm so sorry about that little computer crash for no good reason that I can discern. If only I'd had Monique to help me through that, but I'm back. I'm so sorry for the disruption, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there. Rose, remind me where we were.
So you were taking us through what was happening in the South, obviously, with the Jim Crow laws, and we were getting into why we saw, obviously, the migration from the South to the North as Black folks were moving to different parts of the nation. And you were just sort of taking us through, again, the reasons behind why we had segregation, obviously, in the South. So if you want to pick up there, or I can take you on to another question that's related to it.
No, let me just add a couple more points there. So here we are in the northern states where white people, first of all, lived, right across the border with many of these border communities or southern communities. And, they shared a lot of the same ideas. And so some of those ideas were coming out of white supremacist and racist science and social science of the era. And those ideas impacted not only white Southerners, but many white Northerners as well. Meanwhile, as you've mentioned, Rose, we have the start of some pretty large migrations, internal migrations of African Americans to the North. They really pick up after World War I, so we're not even quite there yet, but certainly Northern Black populations are growing, and these are big growths. They're still growing kind of exponentially. Places like Philadelphia are doubling the size of their Black population, every few years. And whites respond to the growth of the Black communities and the rise of Jim Crow in the South by essentially trying to implement some of those same practices. So whites are using their power to impose segregation on the public schools and on Black communities living in the North. And at the same time, we have these Southern Black families who are moving north. And sometimes when they show up and they get to a city, it was very difficult for Black teachers to work in majority white schools. And in fact, they couldn't. I mean, there were no Black teachers, almost no Black teachers working in schools that were racially mixed or white. And so to gain access to Black teachers, some Black families actually asked for or advocated for or elected to support the option of a separate school with Black teachers in a legally desegregated system, especially if there were some options about whether or not they had to attend that school.
And here's where we get into the core of this book. And within that, now we get to this movement or this call for all Black schools with all Black educators. Interesting, Zoe, because I'd say about what you might agree 10, 15 years ago, maybe 20, being an education reformer was so popular. But we can actually go back to the turn of the 20th century and talk about education reform. Let's talk about this movement with calling for all Black schools with all Black educators here. And I want to take a moment because I want to focus on a few notables here. And of course, one with ties to Atlanta, and that is W.E. Du Bois. And for an audience, if you haven't read it, I think it's still compelling to read. And that is, Does the Negro Need Separate Schools? Published in the Journal of Education in 1935. It's eerily, I mean, you read it, you think, wow, it's some of the same optics eerily of what we're talking about right now in 2021. But I'll let you take it from here, Zoe, and get into this movement and this call for all Black educators, all Black schools, for all Black kids.
Yeah, and this is actually a debate that goes back to the very first public schools in the North. So this is a debate that goes back to the 1840s and even through the Civil War era, as you have African Americans advocating for school integration in the North. They were also pretty aware, everybody understood that usually cost Black teachers their jobs, and that the number of Black teachers in a school system was going to plummet, if not disappear, when those schools were integrated. And so that at least gave people pause. And it's not just because Black children and Black parents loved Black teachers. It is also because Black teachers were a pillar of the Black middle class. It was one of the best jobs you could get as an educated African American and later as a college educated Black person in the North, where the economy was still very racially restricted and racially segregated. So what's happening in this period from 1900 up until World War II, right around 1940, is that you see growing interest and support among Northern Black families for the option, not the requirement, but the option of a separate Black controlled school where there would be Black teachers, a Black principal, and they knew and they could expect, and it would happen, that they would study Black history, they would sing songs and perform plays and have sports teams and cheerleading squads and other things that would open up opportunities for Black students in schools that they might not necessarily have in a racially mixed school. Now, like I was saying, these white Northerners were quite interested in expanding school segregation. And so that is what is happening, is these white school administrators and politicians are conspiring, and they are building new schools and designating them as Black schools. But the question was, number one, this was totally illegal. So they knew that it was illegal. So in order to make this happen, they had to get the Black community, or at least some part of the Black community, to go along with it. And that is how and why they agreed to hire Black teachers for the Black schools. So we see examples in a lot of cities. Dayton, Ohio features prominently, and W.E.B. Du Bois shows up in that debate, where the white school leaders go to the leaders of the Black community in Dayton, Ohio in 1932, and they say to them, we are going to build a brand new high school just for Black students in this town. And the Black community in Dayton was torn. They were like, wow, that doesn't sound great. You know, that's obviously an expansion of school segregation, but we would get a lot of good jobs. And by the way, that might be a benefit for some of our students who struggle. We know they struggle in that majority white high school where in many cases they're not treated very well. And so while they were kind of thinking about it, the white school leaders built the school, hired the principal, hired the teachers, and opened the school. And they then transferred every Black student in Dayton into that high school. So it was kind of a combination. It was like a push-pull factor. And it wasn't, school segregation expands throughout the North between 1900 and 1940, but it wasn't always because of Black preference. It was because of white racism combined with kind of opportunities that were being offered to the Black community in the form of these teaching jobs in all Black schools.
Zoe, is there, and you write about this, there was some opposition because for some civil rights activists, and then there was some groups in the NAACP, which seem to be kind of caught in the middle. Sometimes they lean one way, and then the next decade they lean another. But there was some divisiveness in terms of whether or not this would actually benefit Black children, because integration was seen as this is the way that everyone receives a fair and equal education. Although we must say that W. Du Bois, when he writes, and in the same way, there are many public school systems in the North where Negroes are admitted and tolerated, but they are not educated. They are crucified. So you have this division going on. Take our listeners, our audience through that. Who were the pros? Who were the ones in favor? And who were the ones that were against it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the bigger kind of answer to that is that changes over time, and it depends on the context. And it really depends what Black families decide is the most effective strategy. Black families in the North tend to view school integration as a strategy, not necessarily an objective or a goal that they're fighting for as in and of itself, like an ideal. Whereas Black civil rights leaders and some Black scholars are much more likely to fight for the ideal of school integration. They want public schools to be racially mixed. They don't want separate or segregated schools to exist because they view those as anti-democratic and as inherently problematic for the larger struggle for Black equality and Black freedom. So civil rights leaders are kind of looking at the big picture, the symbolic value, the political climate. Black families and Black teachers tend to have a different question. And their question is, where can my kid get the best education so that they can, by 1930s and 40s, the relationship between an education, a formal education and a high school degree and the kind of job that you're able to get, how much money you can make, just becomes more and more apparent over the course of the 20th century. So Black families are really looking at this like, where can my kid go to school and then get a high school diploma, maybe even go on to college. So Black families tend to be much more pragmatic in their approach, and they're much more concerned about where Black students are going to succeed.
Well, let's talk about that, because there's another optic here, and that is in terms of funding, because we're focusing a lot on local, that term local control. Boy, I tell you, it goes way back, doesn't it? So you talk about local control, but what role is the federal government in all this? Are they saying, are they weighing in on this, or they're letting local communities kind of handle this among themselves?
Right. The federal government is playing virtually no role in this process. The NAACP is trying to persuade the federal government to do so, but that's not happening at this time. Really, schools are under local community control. And I grew up in Virginia, where our school districts were our county. I'm not sure if that's what it's like in the Atlanta region, where school districts and counties kind of overlap. But in the North, school districts overlap usually with townships, so that each small town is its own independent school district. So you get really small and really, really local control of these school districts. And for that reason, it's one reason there's so much variety in what's taking place in the North.
I want to stop for a moment and shift then to your research into this, because you said it was kind of difficult to find because there was no record keeping. So I want to move away from you, the author, and talk about you, the researcher, because you have a lot of data in here. You have a lot of information that you gather from newspapers, speeches, as you were getting this information, Zoe, first of all, how long did it take you to gather everything you needed? And I imagine, did you have some help? Did you get some of those students who needed extra credit work to help you do this research?
I did get some graduate students who were helping me with the research, and they were terrific. Yeah, because this was a lot of work. And it also was really interesting when I was looking at the history of debates over school integration in the North in the 19th century. There's not that much data available. You know, even the school records would be, of course, handwritten, by the way. So when you go into the archives, you're struggling to read people's handwriting on these documents, and there's just not that much that was necessarily preserved. Same with other records like the Black press or the white press or reports by different people. Du Bois did a report on the city of Philadelphia, for example, that was very useful. But over time, the amount of kind of data begins to increase until it becomes actually overwhelming in the other direction by the time you get to kind of 1965 and forward from there, where all of a sudden the government is requiring enormous amounts of record keeping, and scholars are now really kind of digging in, and school districts are keeping tons of records. So it kind of flips from being very little data and evidence to being a ton of data and evidence. But some of the most interesting data came from the Black press. So in in newspapers that were published by African Americans in northern communities, there were all sorts of really interesting stories, sometimes very kind of small, you know, not like huge stories, but little stories about what was going on in a local school. And
Sure.
that would be a wonderful resource, because often they would go and the reporters would talk to teachers and talk to parents and talk to students. So I'd be getting these direct quotes about what was going on and kind of a picture of what was going on in schools. And by the 1920s, in fact, really the whole time, Black reporters and the Black press tended to favor school integration as a strategy. There wasn't a lot of support for separation, and they were very kind of suspicious that if we permit the expansion of school segregation in our northern schools, over time, the quality of these schools will suffer. And that turned out to be true. And so by the time you get to the Great Depression, when school funds were reduced everywhere, school funding was cut everywhere during the Great Depression after 1929, and you have a lot of people documenting exactly what that meant for all Black schools in Philadelphia and all Black schools in places like New Jersey, Ohio, and Illinois, where they had kind of, you know, come into existence either kind of illicitly or illegally, but had expanded and grown over time. And now all of a sudden, when school districts have to cut funds and need to cut corners, it's the Black schools that are really suffering. And it really was very frustrating for Black parents and teachers and everybody, which is why World War II is a real turning point in this story. And by the time you get through World War II and all the servicemen and women who are African American who served in the war, they come home, you have mass migration, a lot of people moving north from the South. And Black communities in the North were done with segregation. When World War II was over and they came home from fighting that war against Nazism, when that war wrapped up, Black Northerners just said, this is it, we are done having segregated schools. And a massive campaign unfolded to advocate for school integration after 1945 in the North.
Well, and that takes us to obviously a very pivotal moment in history, which is Brown versus the Board of Education. And from that, with the Civil Rights Movement. But let's start with Brown versus Board of Education, because that is seen as this milestone of the federal government finally realizing, Washington finally realizing, okay, we cannot exist as a society, as a nation, with segregation. And if it's going to start anywhere, it needs to start here in the schools. And you take that a little bit further in the book for the reader as well, why that was so important.
Yeah, Brown versus Board of Education was a historic ruling everywhere in the United States. It was really intended to apply to legally segregated schools in the South and in the border states. And it didn't end up being used that way. Very quickly, almost immediately in the North, African-American families looked at the Brown ruling and said, that's it. Now we have law on our side, and we're going to use this law to challenge segregation in our schools. And there's really interesting examples in small communities that, most people haven't heard of, just small towns where Black families would go to court and they would bring a lawsuit and they would cite Brown versus Board of Education, and they would say it is illegal to segregate students by race. We see that happening in this community here in New Jersey. We want that to stop. And they were successful. And so Brown versus Board of Education had kind of a powerful influence on how African Americans in the North viewed the struggle for school integration. They saw it as something that applied to them. They believed they could use this law, and they believed it would help them. And one of the kind of frustrating things about what happens next is, so Brown versus Board of Education is 1954, and this was just kind of mobilizing and inspiring for Black families in the North who had already been fighting for school integration since 1940, 1945, after the end of World War II. So this was really, an exciting moment for them. And yet school segregation continued to increase in the North. So at the same time, Northern families and Northern communities are having success, having legal success, school desegregation doesn't really sweep the North until the 1960s. School segregation is going to increase anyway because of residential patterns, because of white and middle class flight to the suburbs, and because of changing demographics. So it's a very kind of frustrating and complicated story for Northerners.
Because it was sort of growing, if people could understand how I'm putting this, it was sort of growing organically because of white flight, because of everyone migrating to communities that look like them. But then at the same time, you also had these inequities and these disparities that were creeping up in the North that folks had experienced in the South. You look at the building of our major interstates and highways, and how that was meant to segregate neighborhoods and communities. So in this notion of, okay, yeah, we're going to integrate schools, but at the same time, you had all these other policies that were being enacted that were creating segregation anyway.
Yeah, and I find that Northern Black support for school integration remained very strong through kind of the traditional civil rights era, through the 50s, through about 1965. And by 1965, you're now talking about Northern Black communities that have been fighting for school integration for decades, for many decades. And they have been using every tool at their disposal. They've used boycotts, they've used petitions, they have sued their school district. They've been successful in those lawsuits, and yet still, in places like New York City and Chicago and Detroit and Boston especially, but also in a lot of suburban communities, it was very, very difficult to engineer those racially mixed schools. And that was the goal, but the level of frustration was just kind of growing and growing. And so there were it's a complicated story to tell because there were so many successes. You can look at the legal record, for example, and you can say, oh, here was a successful court case and another one and another one and another one, and they mandated school desegregation and it was a successful thing. But then when you look at what actually happened in that community or the kind of where it was 10 years later, it's harder to point to those successes. And so it was a frustrating moment in the North. And by the time you get to 1966, there's a growing interest in, again, separate Black controlled schools, but this time we're going to call them community controlled schools. And this is a new movement that flares up in the late 1960s, and it's strongly associated with the Black Power movement and the rise of the Black Power movement.
I was just going to ask you how much of this was spurred on by the civil rights movement or the Black Power movement, or if you want to call it Black nationalist movement. I just did a segment about, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and the Nation of Islam and how that was spurring people to have this Black pride, this Black nationalism sort of ideology. Someone out in the audience says, when we talk about integration, we focus a lot on the students, understandably. What was the effect on the educators and staff? And what happened when Black schools closed?
Thanks. That's a great question and an important one. We know that in the South, for example, during the era of formal school desegregation after 1964, a lot of Black educators, both teachers and administrators, lost their jobs. And it was a major problem, and we still are living with the consequences of that problem today. And a similar thing happened in the North. Interestingly, during this period from 1900 to 1940, where there was pretty widespread support for separate schools in the North, Black teachers were kind of leading the movement of support for separate schools. And there's clear evidence that there just were no jobs for Black teachers outside of those separate schools, or not more than a handful of jobs. There wasn't many. So Black teachers had been strong advocates for separate schools for many years before World War II. And then after World War II, every single Black teacher that I could find supports school integration. There's really a kind of sea change as Black families and Black teachers switch kind of strategies in the post-war era. And Black teachers are at the front of the picket line, challenging and fighting for school integration. And they're clear, they're willing to give up their jobs. And in some cases they did. So for example, there was a school in New Jersey called the Bordentown Manual Training and Industrial School for Colored Youth. And this was a historically Black school established in 1886 that was closed in 1955 as a result of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. It was an all-Black high school. The entire faculty was Black, and there were about 36 teachers there, and they were all fired when that school was closed as a result of the Brown ruling, and they were not placed in other schools. They were simply let go. And we don't know if they were able to find jobs after that. But, there were only a handful of Black teachers elsewhere in the state. There were 36 at this one Black high school and very few anywhere else. So there was implications for the number of Black educators in the North, for sure.
And Denise has a question. Were these Northern Black schools similarly funded with similar facilities?
That is a really good question, and the answer there kind of depends too. So for example, in Dayton, Ohio, when the white community was trying to kind of open a Black high school, and they were trying to persuade the Black community to go along with that, that school was well funded, well resourced, and had very good facilities. And in fact, that was a strategy by the white community. What they wanted to do was remove the Black kids from the white public schools. And if they had to build a nice school to do it, they were willing to do it. And we see the same thing in Cincinnati, where they actually renovate and put a lot of money into updating the schools with majority Black kids, because they don't want those kids to try to, to go back into majority white schools elsewhere in the city. But that wasn't, it was kind of hard to sustain that. And over time, there would kind of inevitably be inequities in funding and resources. So the point where that became clearest was during the Great Depression, when all of a sudden school districts everywhere kind of were short on funds, and they all shortchanged the Black schools. And Black families were like, "Oh, are you kidding me? Like, of course, of course this is what's happening." And so it made it much harder to support separate schools once that funding was so unequal. So it was a kind of changing context. Certainly when Black Power activists in the late 1960s are asking for community control of the school, they are expecting and they're demanding their equal share of the funding. And in those places that experimented with community controlled schools, including New York City and Newark, New Jersey, there was equal funding. So the funding could be equal, but not always.
Jones says the community schools were promoted by Black activism, but didn't foundations like Ford also promote community schools? Does your research consider the relationship between community school funding and activism? And she says, I can read it for myself when I get the book.
Yeah, no, the Ford Foundation was one of a couple of foundations that were putting a lot of money into Black educational reform, trying to equalize public education. And the Ford Foundation funded the community-controlled school experiment in New York City. One of the things that I talk about in my book at length is actually the example of community-controlled schools in Newark, New Jersey, which is, some people kind of know about community controlled schools in New York City. They had a huge fight over the community control of the schools, and it didn't end up well. Newark, New Jersey is a really interesting example because in 1970, they elect a Black mayor. And with a Black mayor, and they have a Black majority in the population, all of a sudden community control overlapped with majority control and political control of the city. And it's a really interesting example, like, well, in New York City, right, like the community controlled schools were in a white dominated city. But what happens when you put community controlled schools in a Black controlled city? And so that's a really interesting case study. And by the way, the answer is nothing good comes of it. Like it still doesn't work. It does not work. The white community has too much power in that city, even as a minority, and even without control of the school board and stuff like that.
So wait, what was busing supposed to do to fix all of this? I know it's a whole nother, but you think about it, and again, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I remember what they did was they started magnet programs.
Yeah.
And they put all these really cool magnet programs on the south side of St. Louis, which was predominantly white. And then so for middle-class Black families, like, you want your child to attend a magnet school? My parents like, yes, absolutely. Okay, but she's got to catch the bus at 5:45. And my parents are like, no way. So they took all these great magnet programs, put them in the white schools on the south side.
Yes.
Changed these once K through 8th grade schools in the Black neighborhoods, made them middle schools, and then bust all the Black kids that want to go to the magnet schools to the south side of St. Louis. That's not how integration is supposed to work.
Well, it was complicated, and every city had a different plan. But the major point, other than I have a dog, goodbye dog. Best not to have a dog. The major point is
not
that
in favor of busing either. So
yeah, the dog is not in favor of the doorbell ringing. The point is that, we've used school buses in America to transport kids to school pretty much forever, since we could have buses and drive kids around. Busing as a concept only became controversial when it was associated with this project of school integration, and specifically racial mixing, right? Like bringing Black kids into white schools. Now, all of a sudden, busing became controversial. So in the North, like in many parts of the South, we have very high degree of residential segregation. And this is something that we now know was deliberate, and it was created through local and state and federal government policies, banking policies, real estate practices. This was a deliberate thing, and it was just a fact of the landscape. So when you talk about creating more racially mixed schools, if you're trying to integrate a school district, you almost always have to bus kids, both Black kids and white kids, out of their neighborhood to attend a school a little bit further away than the closest one to their house. So busing becomes associated with school integration, and only then does it become very controversial. And all of a sudden people start saying, I'm against busing. What they are saying when they said that is, I'm against school integration. That nobody ever meant, I don't want my kid to take a bus to school. They meant, I don't want school integration in my community.
Well, we can look at Boston and what happened there. I believe it's Joanne or Jonna says, are there philosophies of care that developed in these Black schools that could be especially useful as a model right now in relationship to schooling and the pandemic? Good question.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. And the answer to that is yes. And so when we move up the Black Power era and this kind of widespread interest and support for community control schools is short-lived in this Northern period from about 1966 to 1974. And community controlled schools just did not bring about the kind of radical transformative change that many Black educators and Black parents had hoped for. And it was another frustrating and somewhat failed experiment. And so after 1974, what I find is again, widespread support for school integration, but this time, Black families and Black educational activists, teachers, and educators are much more careful about what kind of school integration they're asking for. And this time they start borrowing from positive experiences in separate Black controlled schools. And they start to say things like, you know what? We want to study Black history in our integrated schools. If you're going to take my Black kids and send them to that majority white school, they better be studying Black history in that school and reading some Black literature. And by the way, my child needs to be studying with some Black teachers. There better be Black teachers and Black administrators. And so there was absolutely pedagogical and curriculum practices that had been well established in these all Black, separate Black schools over time. In the South, we know a lot about those, but also in the North. And Black families in the North after 1974 and scholars like Derek Bell started to be very clear that what they were looking for was, meaningful integration or true integration or real integration, one that was more than simply mixing white and Black kids together and saying, boom, that's it, we're done, problem here is solved. And instead saying, okay, first we're going to mix the kids together, and then we're going to very, very carefully make sure that we're modifying the curriculum, that we're addressing pedagogical needs, that we're communicating clearly with families. And there was just kind of a much broader and more holistic approach to creating quality education for everybody, right? And so that was what we see appearing in the late 1970s and kind of carrying forward into the present day. So I don't know if some of you are familiar, but there's currently school integration campaigns in places like New York City by young people, by students. And these are exactly the kinds of demands that they are making. The Black Lives Matter at School is another example of activists, young people around the country who are advocating for school integration. They're challenging segregation and inequality, but they're also centering things like a decolonized curriculum, anti-racist pedagogy, and equal treatment in disciplinary policies, for example, and school tracking and placement policies. So it's a much more comprehensive approach to integration, and one that has been far more successful.
Let me ask you this, because I'm curious, and I think you get into the book. We've been focusing mostly on cities, but the inner cities, but also the suburban folks, because you talk about this promise of suburban integration. I don't want to give too much away, but take the audience through what they're going to get into when they read that chapter.
Yeah, so there were different experiments with integration in suburban settings in the North. And this is something that scholars today pay a lot of attention to, because the demographics of our northern communities have shifted, and now a lot of suburbs, which we used to think of as being, lily white, now a lot of our suburbs are majority Black and brown. And so there's a lot of shifting demographics and much more racial diversity in suburbs around major cities in the Northeast. And so that really changes the struggle for school integration. Montclair, New Jersey, where I live, is one example of a community in the North that has had a pretty successful school integration movement. I'm cautious in describing it as successful because it's not perfect, and there are still problems, and there's definitely people who are working right now, parents and activists and students trying to improve existing inequalities. But it's a really interesting example of a place where Black educational activists and families have been fighting since the 1940s to end segregation in the schools. And beginning in the 1960s, the town of Montclair was under a court order, legal order to begin school integration. And similar to your community, Rose, we created a magnet system here that was designed to basically get families to volunteer to get on the bus. So instead of forced busing, we're cultivating kind of the choice of getting on the bus. And they did that by creating these magnet programs and deliberately drawing kids to different parts of town and then offering free busing to everybody.
And, in my case, in sixth grade, when we started being part of the busing program, I was the only Black student in the sixth grade. The only other Black person, the teacher.
Yep.
That was it. I want to get this last question in because I think it's a great one to end our conversation. What situation, approach, motto has worked the best in terms of education equity? And that's a loaded question because I think it's still in works. But what do you think? What's working, Zoe?
Um, it's a challenging question. And my book closes, or in the last chapter, I look at the example of Hartford, Connecticut.
Mhm.
Now, Hartford is really far from perfect, and it struggles with a lot of different complications there. But they have been able to craft a very ambitious school integration program that has been moderately successful in creating more racially diverse, more racially integrated schools, and opening up access to suburban schools to kids who live in the city. As for the kind of bigger question of like, how do we solve educational inequality? Um, I think there's kind of a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one is that schools probably can't do this all by themselves. And that if we're going to live in a society where we have these profound inequalities and neighborhoods where people living in poverty are concentrated, that's going to make it very difficult to equalize public education. So we have to do more work at the societal level to create equal opportunities for children's families and better support services for things like healthcare and job opportunities in different communities. So it's a kind of, it has to be a systemic and comprehensive solution. You can't just like put in a new curriculum and think that you're gonna solve the problem of racial inequality or educational inequality in the public schools. And the second point that I think it's important to remember is that when we talk about integration and kind of trying to get students to go to these diverse schools, try to deliberately engineer these diverse schools, that's not only so that we can foster educational equity and equality, although that's an important part of it, but it is also to foster the civic ideal of democracy. And we need, if we are going to live in a democratic society, and if we plan on raising the next generation of people to understand democracy in a critical and profound way, those kids have to go to school. All of them, white kids, black kids, brown kids, everybody needs to have an opportunity to go to school in diverse settings. That's a civic ideal. It's related to democracy, and it's important. I don't think we value that enough. I think that could be something that we emphasize more clearly and say this is important, not just to try to equalize opportunities for kids who might be poor or kids who might be at a bad school, but it's instead a way to enrich education for all students in this country, and one that we need to hold on to.
So can your book be a model for that in terms of looking upon the past and how we got this far in somehow creating that pathway to what you just talked about?
I think we have to know our history to understand where we are and how to address inequalities. One of the things that this book highlights is that African Americans have been fighting for integration and educational equality in the North since 1840, constantly, and that problem has not yet been solved, and that this has been a very active site of civil rights activism in the North. So when you're looking at the Northern Civil Rights Movement, schools feature very prominently there, and so do young people, students, and so do women, especially mothers and teachers. So it's a really kind of important way, I think, to recognize that this has been a long fight and one that a lot of people have been very active in for a long time. And the other thing this history really emphasizes is the degree of white racism and white resistance to school integration in the North. This is not something that popped up in 1974 in Boston. Oh my goodness, look at these crazy people in Boston. No, this has been happening persistently and consistently. Static. It's a static phenomenon. It's not a changing phenomenon since 1840. I mean, I've uncovered hundreds of battles for school integration in the North, in rural communities, suburban communities, and cities. And while I did find sometimes white allies who were vocally advocating on behalf of Black families in these struggles, I never found a white community that threw its political, economic, and social power behind school integration. That never happened. It was always a story of white resistance. And that's an important lesson to understand. I think we need to be clearer about the challenges that we face trying to integrate schools and the level of white resistance that we can expect to meet, because we will meet it. It is there. It's always there.
Well, Zoe, I hope they don't put your book on the banned CRT list. You know, that's happening. So the book is An African American Dilemma, A History of School Integration and Civil Rights in the North. It is a compelling read. I enjoyed. Zoe, thank you so much for taking time. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Rose, thank you so much for speaking with me tonight and for your great questions. And thank you to the audience, to everyone who was here, who joined us tonight, and to those of you who contributed questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, Claire, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Rose. And thank you, Zoe. It was such an interesting conversation. And I know I learned something new, and I'm already like flipping back through the book, trying to find a few more things I think I might have missed the first time. So if you haven't yet purchased your copy of the book, An African American Dilemma, it is excellent. It's such a great overview of everything that Rose and Zoe talked about tonight. There's so much more where that came from. So please do get your copy of the book from Atlanta History Center's museum shop. There's a link to do that in the chat. One other thing that I wanted to let you guys know about tonight is that Atlanta History Center is participating in a nationwide study to measure our social impact. So we are seeking to understand more about how our programs and our campus and our experiences help our community. So if you're interested in helping us do that, I'm posting a link in the chat right now. We're looking for participants. It's free to participate. You would just visit the History Center a couple times during the year and give us some feedback so we can continue to improve what we do here. So we'd so appreciate your participation if you're interested. Again, Rose, Zoe, thank you so much for tonight's conversation. If you enjoyed tonight, there's lots more conversations that you can find at atlantahistorycenter.com. We have 2 upcoming talks that I think everyone on this call will be very interested in. The first is they're actually both a week apart. So the one next week is with Dr. Carolyn Roberts. And she is a Yale historian, and she is currently working on a manuscript of a book called To Heal and to Harm, Medicine, Knowledge, and Power in the Atlantic Slave Trade. And it's absolutely fascinating. So that's a week from today. And 2 weeks from today, we'll be welcoming Alan Guelzo with his new biography of Robert E. Lee. So both of those talks are upcoming. They promise to be very interesting. They're free. All that at atlantahistorycenter.com. Rose and Zoe, thank you so much again for tonight. We enjoyed it, and maybe one day we'll get to bring you down to Atlanta, Zoe, but we so appreciate you joining us from afar tonight.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you, Rose.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, everybody. It was a great conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.